समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Eyes across the world will be focused at the end of the month on the megaport of Tianjin, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi is set to meet President Xi Jinping in what's being hailed as a dramatic reset of the China-India relationship. Earlier this month, as you know, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval and China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi agreed to discuss what are called the early harvest proposals, which would fast-track a border settlement in Sikkim, leaving aside the two more contentious regions of Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh. This is all of obvious importance. It shows India's willing to consider putting Galwan and Doklam behind it and get back to normalizing its relationship with the world's second largest economy. There's another side to this chessboard though, which doesn't get looked at quite so much, and other countries trying to fill up that chessboard with their own pieces. 2 days after China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with Prime Minister Modi, he was in Kabul, holding hands with Pakistan's Ishaq Dar and Afghanistan's Amir Khan Muttaqi. This is their third meeting since May, when they began talks on extending the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, into Afghanistan. That China is seeking to build a new kind of geopolitical order in continental Asia isn't news. Through the Belt and Road Initiative and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, China has invested billions of dollars in new roads and rail lines, stretching clean across Asia into Europe. India has stayed out of the BRI, but like Brazil, hasn't shut the door on creating synergies with it. The clues on how all this might eventually work lie in the fate of what happens with a 50-kilometer dust-blown road cutting past 7,000 high-meter mountains through the Chakmateen Lake and the Murghab River, a region inhabited for most of the year only by ethnic Kyrgyz nomads. Now the Afghans are pushing for a road and railway line that would connect Kashgar to Kabul through the Wakhan Corridor, giving them direct access to China's economy and cutting Pakistan out of the picture. There is already a railway line running from Nantong to Hairatan, but that serves Afghanistan's north, not the ethnic Pashtun heartland. For reasons of security, but also economic viability, the Chinese aren't so sure about this Wakhan Corridor route. Then again, these kinds of big investments might be what is needed to get Afghanistan to stop turning a blind eye to Tehreek-e-Taliban and Baluch terrorists who are tormenting China's other ally, Pakistan. And they'll give China a buffer just in case Field Marshal Asim Munir's Pakistan leans too far towards America. To understand why this tiny stretch of land, the Wakhan Corridor, just a few dozen kilometers wide, occupies such space in strategic discussions, we'll need to take a journey through the history of how three empires came to collide in this desolate landscape. Welcome to this week's issue of ThePrint Explorer, and a special thanks to those of you joining us for the first time. Khwaja Mir Khan, ambassador of the Afghan ruler Ahmad Shah Durrani, had arrived at the palace of renewed splendor, traveling with tribes from Kazakhstan, Kokand and Badakhshan. His mission was to pay tribute to Emperor Gaozhong of Qing, fourth of his line. For reasons we aren't sure about, Mir Khan initially refused to perform the famous kowtow before the emperor, that is 3 kneelings and 9 head knockings. To Mir Khan, the submission might have seemed a betrayal of his Islamic beliefs, but he was soon surrounded and shouted at by panicked Chinese imperial diplomats. Our great lord is the ruler who has united all under heaven, the Chinese officials remonstrated on that winter day in 1763, according to court records studied by scholars Yul Ek and Timur Khan. Do you bow before heaven? Mir Khan grudgingly accepted their logic and did what was asked for. For the next few days thus, Mir Khan was able to participate in the delights that had been organized for the new year, which in China fell in February, including the annual Manchu ice skating spectacle, joining the emperor in the Happy Together garden to watch military displays while drinking Chinese imperial tea. The centerpiece of Mir Khan's visit, however, was to hand over a letter to the emperor, which he hoped would demonstrate Ahmad Shah Durrani's claims to be recognized as a great emperor in his own right. Texts of Ahmad Shah's letter have not survived, but the Chinese emperor's responses to the account he was given, which was of the Third Battle of Panipat, were a little dismissive. This is what he said. Balaji was able to assemble such a force and then did not attack, but instead retreated to the fortress city of Panipat to sit and wait for annihilation. That is a matter I truly cannot understand. In other words, the Chinese emperor was saying that Ahmad Shah Durrani's win wasn't that impressive. Emperor Gaozong wasn't wrong, of course, as military historians will tell you. The Jat chief Surajmal as well as several Maratha generals had been unable to understand their own leader's strategy either. They had advocated that the numerically weaker Maratha forces, which were operating moreover hundreds of kilometers from their capital, use guerrilla tactics that would draw the enemy into the ravines of the Chambal and play for time as the monsoon neared. That's another story. The bigger point was this. The king emperor was clearly interested in defining the limits of his own empire by demanding the submission of rulers and tribes on his peripheries. He had a frontier policy, not a foreign policy, and that meant he wasn't very interested in the Afghan empire, the Indians, or anyone else. Fighting regularly broke out in the borderlands, mostly to the emperor's irritation. The brothers of the erstwhile Central Asian kingdom of Bolor feuded, and the emperor was outraged when one requested support from imperial troops against the other. In 1765, the large Altishahri city of Uch Turfan rebelled, and quelling the revolt was an enormous effort. In 1768-1769, when the Afghans invaded Badakhshan, the emperor simply ignored the local rulers' requests for help. Emperor Gaozong thus ordered, and I quote, "There is no point in interfering in their mad behavior towards one another. Ablai, the Kazakh Khan, and Irdana of Kokand pillage and plunder one another's territories. As some generals and officials were still paying attention to this, I have issued an edict instructing them that they may not interfere. The mutually murderous conduct among them all is the normal state of affairs." Emperor Gaozong knew where heaven ended, and Ahmad Shah Abdali's lands were beyond it. For Abdali, in turn, geography and resources militated against any effort to expand westward. The thing was, new empires were rising in the region, whether the Chinese wanted them or the Afghans wanted them or not. The East India Company's rout of the Nawab of Bengal in 1757 began a massive period of expansion in British colonization of India, leading it to bump up against China. The Opium War of 1840-1842, fought by the British to force the Chinese to allow the import of more opium, which was followed by a second war in 1856, were disastrous for the Chinese emperor. Before 1800, China's imperial borders were defined by this loosely held amalgam of conquered peoples, united by common subordination to the same ruling house. Now, for the first time, they also needed a better idea of just what lay past the borders of China. Lacking a professional cadre of geographers, historian Matthew Mosca writes, imperial Chinese officials were unable to arm themselves with what he calls a mathematically based visual rendering of the earth of the kind pursued by contemporary map makers in Europe. The one court map produced on scientific lines using staff trained by visiting Christian missionaries proved useless in actual planning. Bengal was excluded and information on the eastern Himalaya was very, very thin. Even as China struggled to come to terms with the rise of the British across its Tibetan borders, contact between the two empires grew on the coasts. Maritime trade led to a permanent Indian population which was resident at Guangzhou. The first Parsi merchant visited China in 1756, and the Indian population subsequently rose in parallel with that of private British traders. W.C. Hunter in Guangzhou between 1825 and 1854 recalled seeing, I quote, Parsis, Moormen or other natives of India. Another merchant claimed that there were 200 Parsi residents of Guangzhou in 1825 against 40 born Englishmen. Essayists writing for the Chinese court, though, were only in the 1830s able to make the connection between the Bengal merchants, English colonial rule in India, and Imperial Britain. The English were, however, also beginning to push over the mountains. Early in 1810, the explorer, mathematician, and physician Thomas Manning began his journey into Tibet, becoming the second Englishman to do so and the first since 1783. Together with his Chinese teacher, a Catholic convert called Shao Qingsu, Manning arrived at Fari in the Chumbi Valley, that's north of Sikkim, seeking permission for an audience with the Dalai Lama. He was ordered back without incident. A template had been sent. The Daoguang emperor pointed out, foreign tribes are extremely distant and hard to investigate, and matters beyond the frontier can fundamentally be set aside and ignored. Securing the frontier, though, was critical, and he ordered that all frontier posts in the area be put on high alert. The king state still had no concern with the world around it. Not in treaty making, not in alliance building, just ring fencing its boundaries. The British were also wondering how to ring fence their own empire in India, but they knew stringing guard posts to shoo away travelers wouldn't cut it. For 2 decades, Imperial Russia had been driving south into Central Asia. Following the Second Anglo-Afghan War in 1868, Amir Abdul Rahman, then a refugee in Samarkand, was installed by the British as Afghanistan's ruler. The Russians were by this time at the town of Merv, just 200 kilometers from Herat, and from Herat the routes to Persia and India. The British funded Amir Khan, hoping his new client state in Afghanistan would take on the job of deterring Russia. London and St. Petersburg, which was then the Russian capital, did succeed in hammering out a border deal between Afghanistan and Russia as this southern push grew too uncomfortable. In 1887, a boundary protocol was signed, drawing a border along the Oxus River to Zulfikar Pass. This wasn't the end of the problem, though, because the Russians were also prodding on the other end of Afghanistan, the eastern side. In 1891, learning that Russian troops had arrived in the Pamir Mountains, the legendary officer and adventurer France's young husband was dispatched to investigate. He discovered a Colonel Yanov who showed him a map, and I quote from young husband, with a given line on it indicating the limits of the annexation. It embraced considerable pieces of what was clearly Chinese and Afghan territory and extended to the southern side of the Hindu Kush to territory under the suzerainty of Kashmir. Young husband joked when he saw this map, saying the Russians were opening their mouth pretty wide. And the Russian officer laughed back, saying this was only the beginning. This time, Sir Mortimer Durand, whose role in Afghan-Pakistan map-making we explored in an earlier episode of Explorer, negotiated a deal which settled the boundary yet again. This time, a China-Afghan-Russian border was hammered out in the Pamir Mountains. In essence, it created a tiny, narrow corridor of Afghan territory going on to China to put space between Russia and Britain. I quote, "From the 6th mile, a rugged and inaccessible spur of the Sarikol range carries the boundary into regions of perpetual ice and snow to its junction with the main range. Here, amidst a solitary wilderness 20,000 feet above sea level, absolutely inaccessible to man and within the ken of no living creature Except the Pamir Eagle, the three great empires actually meet. No more fitting trijunction could possibly be found. The Chinese, of course, were not present to sign this agreement, though they would, in the interest of settling their relationship with Afghanistan, eventually agree on the Wakhan Corridor boundary in 1964. So why does all this ancient history matter again today? Well, it matters partly for the same reasons borders matter to Indians. Having been humiliated through their century of colonial primacy, their borders drawn without as much as asking them, China wishes to ensure it remains in control not just of its neighborhood, but the continent behind it. The Belt and Road Initiative is at its heart not just a commercial enterprise, but an effort to make sure Asia is tied to Beijing, as it was not in the 18th and 19th century, leaving it a third-rate power governed by the whims of distant empires. This is psychological, sure, but psychology does matter to nation-states. Against this, there are pragmatic considerations which Beijing also has to think about. As Hong Shang and Amar Malik have noted, the $62 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor is on the cusp of becoming a complete white elephant. Lack of industrialization in Pakistan has meant transport infrastructure built to serve it never earned any returns. The future of the port of Gwadar is, to put it very gently, uncertain. It handles hardly any shipping. Electricity that was meant to power all this industry is not being used. As China grapples with its own internal economic challenges, it will become ever harder to justify throwing good money after bad. Yet again, there are security issues. Fighting has surged across Pakistan's northwest, and all of Afghanistan remains deeply disturbed. In a significant number of recent attacks, the scholar Ayaz Wani notes, Chinese nationals have been targeted. The last thing China needs is for the Wakhan Corridor to become a highway for Uyghur jihadists returning home from their bases in Syria or Turkey to make their way there to Xinjiang, which was pacified with great difficulty over 2 decades. Fixing the problem China understands needs both economic and social stabilization. Following the return of the Taliban regime, Beijing has invested in oil extraction and lithium in Afghanistan. In 2023, China's Xinjiang Central Asia Petroleum and Gas Company signed a contract with the Taliban government to invest $550 million over the next 3 years in oil extraction. According to Taliban officials, China also wants to put another $10 billion into developing Afghanistan's lithium reserves. The Wakhan Corridor might be a small bit of territory, but it's a big part of this puzzle. Linking Afghanistan seamlessly to China might not be a big-ticket economic prize, but it would improve connectivity through Afghanistan into Central Asia and Iran and tie the Islamic Emirate more deeply to Beijing's geopolitical goals. It would also signal to Pakistan that should it stray too far towards the West, Beijing has its own fish to fry in Central Asia and its own ties to Afghanistan. For 200 years, China failed to craft a foreign policy and paid the price. It isn't going to make that mistake again. It's for India now to see what opportunities can be located in this evolving landscape and to try and leverage them for its own advantage. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor with ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of ThePrint Explorer.